welcome to our special guest here at Shades Injustice Podcast, Miss and Dr. Mary Clifford and Miss Alison Feigh. We are excited to have you both back again. And we're doing this special series, of course, about breaking layers of injustice for women. And I am so excited about you guys because you all bring such expertise to the table that I believe our audience will benefit from. And so I just can't hardly wait to get started on tonight. Dr. Clifford, you asked several questions at the end of our session last time, and I went back to listen to your questions over and over again, and I got a little piece of some of them and sent them back to you all so you all could begin thinking about some of those questions. And but before we get started again, Dr. Dr. Clifford. Who in the world is Dr. Edwards? Dr. Clifford and Alison, hey, would you both introduce yourself and tell us again a little bit about your book?
So go ahead, Alison, please.
I was going to say you do it alphabetically, that'd be you first, but my name is Alison Feigh. I serve as the director of Jacob Wetterling Resource Center in Minnesota, which is one of the programs under Zero Abuse Project. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to work with Dr. Clifford on a book that's coming out in April. I'll let her do the title reveal because I know that she'll get it exactly right. That will be a textbook to look at sexual violence from a prevention lens. So I'll toss it your way.
Yeah, you know, the book itself, again, Mary Clifford, I teach in the Criminal Justice Department at St. Cloud State, and I'm currently working on the Community Anti-Racism Education Initiative, which is a kind of sidebar, but again, I hope we can talk a little bit about how it's related. But the book has been a work in progress, and it took us quite a bit of time to get it completed. But one of the things that I'm absolutely thrilled about in terms of the compilation of the book is its title is Sex Crimes and Offenders, right? The idea is we're looking at just the criminal and the offender as a primary, but we're exploring questions of character and culture. That's the subtitle. And so the idea, of course, is how do we talk about the types of offenses that are violations, committing, harm against another person in a sexualized way? How do we do that? But how do we also look at the influences on an individual? Because one of the questions, Evelyn, that we had talked about starting with is the idea of who these offenders are, and can we see them, know them, and can we somehow pick them out? And we have had as many mythical stories about offenders as we have real stories about offenders. And so for us, I think one of the things, I'll let Alison speak for herself, but for me, one of the big things about this book that I really appreciated was the idea that we could sit for a minute and look at not only the individuals, but what are the social influencing factors on individuals. And I think if we start really looking at it, especially the offenders who we kind of casually overlook, if you can say that, I mean, it's true. I think historically and culturally, we've seen certain kinds of people as offenders. And a silly analogy or story would be the person jumping out from behind the bush, the trench coat grandpa or whatever. You have this story about who the offender is, but then when it comes down to it, we know that offenders live with kids. We know that offenders know kids, teach kids, work with kids, work with other people. And so, it's not just kids that have that profile. So it's often people that are close to us, often people we love, people we say we love, and who we treat in these really unfortunate, violent ways. And so I think for us, the title is pretty descriptive and I hope pretty expansive, because as we talked a little bit about last week, one of our focal points was, how do you have a healthy sex talk? How do you have this kind of common understanding of what it means to be in a sexually healthy relationship? What does that mean to the people involved? And how do we get from there to this place where we criminalize? And then, of course, there's just so much in each individual community that is a tidbit different and a tidbit unique to that community. But there are some common themes. And so it's those common themes that we wanted to spend a little time talking about but to lean in on healthy, and then to talk a little bit about those social influencing factors, in addition to the kind of who is a prototypical kind of offender.
This is fabulous. I love this conversation. And I'm going to tell you why, because of the analogy you used, the guy in the trench coat coming out of the bushes. And that is so spot on as far as who we think offenders are, when in reality, we know that 90% of the sexual assaults and offenders are people we know and are comfortable being around. So I'm fascinated. Right off the bat, I would like for you all to dig in and start talking about the type of cultural influences that may somehow influence that individual who finds themselves in a spot where they are the offender. So would you, either one of you could take that and run with it?
I think we do so much work in our culture when it comes to help, where we try to put all the onus of prevention on the people who are at risk. We do a lot of, like, let's harden the target. Let's teach the person how to carry their keys through their hands so they can jab someone in the eye. Like, I learned that in driver's ed. I've never once had to jab someone in the eye with my keys, right? But that's like, cover your cup, stay with your buddy. We put so much onus on the target and saying, don't, here's how to harden targets that you can't get hurt. We have to spread that out. That's the very tip of the iceberg. That's the least effective messaging. We have to find those who are making the choice to cause harm. And we usually catch that in language. We usually catch that in how they break little rules, how they ignore small boundaries. We can catch that before it becomes bigger and get help early on, especially when they're juveniles. The trajectory for them is better than letting it snowball. And I want to be really careful here. I'm not saying that, I want to be clear to say that the responsibility for causing the harm is on the shoulders of the person causing the harm. Like, that's on them. We're not going to delegate that responsibility somewhere else. That's on them. They need to work on why they're wanting to cause harm. So that piece. But then let's also find the people who have nothing to do with it, that are not the targets and aren't the person causing the harm, and equip them as bystanders. What does it mean to go from bystander to being upstander, right? And it doesn't mean going after the person causing the harm. It means interrupting stuff, catching it when it's small, but how do we support the targets? And just the idea that there's room at the table for everybody, and in our culture, for everybody to see that they have a place at the table when it comes to prevention. As a bystander, as an upstander, as someone who has maybe been a target at some point, and somebody who's maybe knows someone or is someone who's having problematic behaviors around when it comes to consent, when it comes to interactions, that could turn criminal real quick. So I think it's just that idea about putting the onus on the person causing harm and less onus on the person who's the target. Dr. Clifford, I'll toss that your way.
Well, and I would just say too, Evelyn, one of the things we have to talk about with more intentionality is the whole conversation about power and how power is used, right? So yes, we can come back around to this, or we can integrate it here, but I think we're used to talking about how power plays out in oppressive ways, right? So when we talk about racism, historically, white folks owned and had power over slaves, right? Historically, culturally, socially, women were owned by the men who they married in ways that were seen as comparable to property, and they had a kind of control your wife tone and tenor before the idea, and even written into law, it was not this idea that you could not rape your wife, is a codification into law, right? So the idea of how we use power over someone is clearly a social value, right? And so when you think about sexual violence and sexual harms, there's a lot of mythology around who is the person who is a rape victim, or who is an acceptable rape victim, who is a person who is believable when they've been sexually assaulted. And so when you combine this racialized knowing culturally with this other kind of sexualized knowing, we know the statistics tell us that women who are Black women are on the forefront of that conversation as victims who are not seen as appropriate victims, believable victims, victims who are seen as legitimate victims in some ways. And so that is all cultural, that is all contextualized within this larger social structure and setting, right? And so again, we could have a podcast on this very small theme that would take us more than half an hour and still not cover it as well as I'd like. But I think the value goes back historically, and then we have to think about it, how we move it forward, because historically we know that white men who owned slaves did not ask about consent when there were, and in fact, we know that they used sexual violence to produce more slaves. I mean, we know that there were slave farms producing. We know that there was a sexualization and a castration of men who were lynched, for example. I mean, we know that there are historical kind of power usages of sexualized nature that go well beyond just, well beyond rape. But I think of rape just because it's kind of one of those things that stands out. But we often talk about lynching, but we don't talk about the things that happened that were intentionally done to Black male bodies. And we don't talk about how some parts of those bodies were often taken as trophies. And so we don't talk about how the history of the doctors in gynecology used slave women to kind of experiment, to perfect the practices that they would then later use on white women in white hospitals. And so I think when you start looking at how many ways that you can use power in a sexualized way, you can see how the conversation gets bigger and bigger.
Absolutely. How do you feel like our culture right now with TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, tweeting, all the different social media opportunities with so much inappropriate sexual context? What do you think? How does that impact for this as part of our conversation tonight? How does that?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to jump in quick. And then Allison, this is all Allison. I mean, the one thing I want to say is the media pieces are so important historically before social media, right? So can we talk just a little bit about how you covered an offender who committed a horrible crime against a young child, how the pictures were displayed in the media? Can we talk about how the stories were covered in the media? I mean, Allison and I have had many conversations about how there's almost a glorification of the violence of this sexualized nature. And of course, we talked a little bit last time about the shows that are all about sexual violence and investigating sexual harms. But in order to investigate, you have to have the sexualized harm. And then it becomes this kind of, oh, well, that's just a thing we do before we do the investigation. And we don't want to just make that kind of this normal kind of behavior. And I think in some ways, how we talk about the crimes that happen and how we don't talk about priests, for example, who committed sexual abuses for years and generations and centuries, that we don't talk about that in the same way. And so media, again, can get really big beyond just social media. I just wanted to throw that in before we go straight to social media, Allison.
Well, when we were writing the book, we kind of, every chapter, we had questions as to how the media relates, because people say the media. And like, even in one channel, in one city, you're going to have two people sitting next to each other with very different values about how a story should, you're going to have a news editor who's going to say, this is how I want it done. It's like the media is individuals with their own agendas, training. And so we're really big in like training news media on how to be victim aware. Anyway, when it comes to social media, I think the piece that, again, this is a whole nother like 4-hour conversation, but I think we go back to, we don't want to vilify the teens who are trying to swim in this toxic water that we as adults have created for them. Like I remember about a decade ago, Abercrombie and Fitch came out with thong underwear for kids age 10, 8 to 10. It said wink, wink, and eye candy on the thong underwear, and everyone freaked out, and it was pulled from the shelves right away. I think we have to think about that and say, it's not the 8-year-old sitting at the boardroom table saying, can you please make thong underwear for me with sexualized terms on it? Like, it's adults sitting around a table saying,
that's
what
right.
Yes. To the kids yet? What haven't we marketed to them yet? And should we, 11 to 17-year-olds are the age that are most often targeted online. Their brains aren't done yet. Like the last part of their brain to be done is the part of the brain that says, is this a good idea? We hand them tools that say, what are you thinking right now? How are you feeling right now? And like the big two messages with parents is like, model for your kids stepping away from their devices when you're worked up. Because people make most of their harmful choices to other people when they're emotionally worked up. People do things that later they regret when they're worked up. Like we as adults, we're not seeing that behavior where we are modeling that for our kids, being like, I'm really worked up, something's on my phone. Like we have to role model and talk through that behavior in our culture. And then the second thing is we just have to be wary of people who want to engage with us about sex. Like people who are using social media to harm kids. They're talking about sex within a half hour of the conversation. They're talking about it within like right away. And most people do use the internet well, right? Like most people don't hurt kids. Most people do get it. But someone wanting to talk to you on a chat app about sex at 2 in the afternoon is not one of the healthy ones, right? So like helping young people with sort of the warning signs and role modeling that behavior that we as adults aren't doing. Like we are not walking away from our devices when we're upset. When we're upset, we're getting our video out and, you know, doing what we do and you know, I want to be careful because sometimes we do need to get our video out. Like sometimes that's the way of being a good bystander or, you know, but just the sense of like stepping away and not vilifying the kids that they're swimming in this toxic water that adult folks have created for them. And we do need to do a better job of getting upstream and having their voices be a part of that and not just us wagging our finger at them and being like, kids today, like that's.
Well, and Evelyn, just as an example, you know, my daughter was probably 4 when we went to Target and she paused and she's like, Mom, we don't know that lady that she was talking about the checkout clerk. She had heard stranger danger and she was just like, oh, what are we going to do? And so the idea of good touch, bad touch is confusing for kids because sometimes touches feel good, right? And so we've had programs that have been developed for educational purposes for kids that we had to modify collectively, the royal we, because the messaging for kids is confusing because kids will see more strangers than they will see people they know. And when you do stranger danger, you don't teach them to stay away from the uncle or the grandpa or the dad or whomever, the neighbor, who is more likely because they know them and they've talked to them and they may have even groomed them to be a victim. So
it's not
I
how we
think
know
those are
them.
just,
It's what are they asking us to do? It's not how we know them. What are they asking me to do? Because it's almost always someone we know and like. So the question isn't, do we know them or not? The question is, what are they asking me to do?
thank you.
And I love that, Allison and Dr. Clifford, both of you all are right on point because I've watched kids. I've tried to be careful even with my kids and grandkids as they were growing up. How do I teach them to be safe? And when you said it's not the person, it's what are they wanting me to do? That to me is key. Do they want me to sit on their lap? Well, I used to love to sit on my mom and dad's lap. I used to love that, but then I had 4 younger siblings, so that went out the window. But but the point is, was it safe for me to sit on my dad's lap? Yeah, it really was. But now an uncle or grandpa or something like that, I would assume it would be safe, but not necessarily. So
and we go back to most people do know the safety rules. Kids do need healthy attention and affection to thrive.
Yes.
We don't want to pull hugs. We don't want to pull, you know, and say never touch a kid. Like kids need healthy hugs and handshakes and like to thrive. So we don't pull that away. But when we're doing our parent classes, it's how does this person make me feel and what are they asking me to do? In my gut, does it feel like that they're too good to be true? Or does it feel like they're making me feel like I'm on a roller coaster? Like, let's check in with our gut. And then also, then the follow-up is, are they doing something that's against our rules? And what are our rules as a family? And I mean, that's a whole, again, each of these topics is its own thing. But if we focus on the unknown person, we're not protecting our kids.
Yes, that's so very, very true. Dr. Clifford, you mentioned earlier about the historical sexual violence and how racism and sexual assault and all that kind of intertwined. You want to talk a little bit more about that and even bring it up to the 21st century? Um, because several times we have noted a lot of these sexual crimes, and I've read articles that African American women in particular are one of the most dangerous species as far as being vulnerable to sexual assault and violence. So you want to talk about that intersection a little bit?
Sure. And in fact, the word is intersectionality, and it's a Kimberly Crenshaw term she developed. She also does work on critical race theory, which is a reflection, an effort to reflect back not only the legal origins of the history of how we govern society using laws created by white men in power. When we created those laws in the Constitution, of course, remember, slaves were owned by those white men in power who created those laws, policies, and practices. And so it's going to be really important for us to think about how women couldn't vote and Black folks were a third of a person, depending upon how far you want to go back in history. And so the idea of the racialization of sexual violence goes back to this, again, the story of how property was treated, and women were talked about as property and sexually assaulted by the terms of standard today was often overlooked or not discussed or even characterized in a context historically. Or there's that whole kind of cultural bravado that happens around men and access to sex. And so I should be careful because, again, I'm polarizing men and women in a sexualized way, but we realize that you can be sexually assaulted by anyone, any gender, any
That's correct. Yes.
Gender. So I think that the intersectionality piece asks us to think about how power plays into the conversation. And because Black women have had less social power, less political power, now I can't not say, remember, in the last history of civil rights and the history of voting rights, we have seen Black women rise to the level of an awareness that has created, some people say Black women, maybe Black people, but Black women have saved democracy in the United States because of the powerful context they've operated out of, right? This idea that there's an intentional, deliberate effort to secure more power because the power is granted to us, to everyone, to them, to Black women by the Constitution. And so there's a lot of questions about how and if, in fact, Kimberly Crenshaw and others are trying to figure out, if you were to rewrite the Constitution now, if you were to secure life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness now, and you were to empower women in a way they were not empowered, and you were to empower Black folks in a way they were not empowered, what would that look like in the context? And then, of course, the idea that there has been devaluation, dehumanization, makes it a contextually interesting conversation, horrifying as it is. If you look at the criminal justice and the applications of the criminal justice systems, remember, in my home state of Oklahoma, there was a police officer who targeted Black women for quite some time because he didn't think they would be believed. And in fact, I can't not say that his GPS put him in the locations where these women told police he had been. And so it was easier to believe the GPS than it was to believe these women who were saying he sexually assaulted me, right? That
is a phenomenal thing that happened. We have the same challenges here, probably 10 to 15 years ago. The exact same thing here. The women were not believed, or they were dehumanized. Oh, well, that's just a Black woman and she does tricks and she's, who believes her? And I'm a police officer, so I absolutely can do whatever I want to do to you because they'll believe me, they won't believe you. And then the power base, again, they can write up anything. And thank God for the good police officers that really are good and do things appropriately versus those that are toxic on the police force. But I appreciate you bringing that up because that happens over and over again. I would imagine across the country where that power brokerage is there, and the African American female or Hispanic are often not believed where the officer is, and they're the ones that are toxic.
Yeah, and remember the
missing culture where they're not even gonna put themselves in a position to see if they're gonna be believed or not, because I don't want to put my family at risk. I don't want to put my immigration status at risk. I don't speak the language. I don't understand. And so it's not even about getting a chance to tell their story. They're just automatically, pushed to the side because they don't have access to the same systems that other folks do.
So this is something for you all to think about. I noted when Weinstein was being investigated and all the different women came to the forefront, out of all the women that came, I think it was at least 80. I don't believe, and I could be wrong, I'm gonna go back and check. I don't believe there were even 10 African-American women that came forward. But I do believe Weinstein did not discriminate. I believed he forced himself on women of all colors. I really do. What do you all think about that theory? That's just me.
I don't know specifically who his victims were, what his victim pool was, but I think about all the people in power who've showed us who they are and we didn't believe them. Like you think about Bill Cosby, right? And that very powerful cover of all those women sitting in those chairs being like, we told you. And he told us what he was doing. And we did.
Absolutely. We laughed at it.
Yeah. And so I think just the idea, I don't necessarily know what Weinstein's victim pool was, but I feel like all the culture of this is happening, we all know that it's happening, no one's holding this person accountable, then allows other people to keep that torch going. I mean, we've seen in like theater companies or sports organizations, like if you have someone in a position of power using their power to cause harm, other people in positions of power that creates a culture where they're like, oh, I'm going to do this too. And then we have this huge ripple effect. But Dr. Clifford, I think I interrupted you before. So
I was just going to highlight the missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives is probably one of the most well-organized women of color movements in the moment, right? And I think that it has come from a horrible history of the same kind of abuse and violence that we're talking about. But I also wanted to highlight, remember, we had indentured servants. Women came across the sea and worked for men as domestic, or for families as domestic workers for some time. And there's stories, just scads of stories of these indentured servants who would become pregnant as if it was by magic, and then there was not an accounting. And in fact, there were some cases where she would be accused of nefarious behavior or practice or other things. And so I think that we can't forget the way that history has dismissed the victims' stories and really also at the same time dismiss the perpetrators' accountability at the same time. And so I think we have to just be reminded of boys being boys is a phrase. In fact, I said that out loud one time to my brother. He's like, that's not a phrase we use in our house. And he has 3 boys. And he's like, there are intentional kind of practices that we do so that we educate young men. Now, this goes back to the earlier conversation about culture and the values of how we prioritize individual humanity, right? So is it humanizing or dehumanizing to force someone into an action that they are not interested in? I mean, at some level, it seems that basic. However, we have this context around that where men get to decide or women feel compelled to, and I think those are really important social conversations as well.
This was the fastest 30 minutes of my life right here today.
It always goes so fast in life.
Absolutely phenomenal information. I think we may need to do another one.